Okay, welcome to the Lukens National Historic District tonight. I'm your host, Scott Houston, president of the Greystone Society, and happy to have you all here tonight to talk about Black History Month and the contributions of a few of our Americans and their particular experience. You know, it's interesting as we go through the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and you know, there are different commemorations taking place in the past and a couple of years going up about the you know, that critical time in America. And you know, for instance, next year, you know, we're going to talk, or next month, we're going to talk about the iron contribution. But you know, tonight is tonight, you know, is February 3rd. It is Black History Month. And we're excited about talking about, you know, the African American experience. And tonight is Fighting for Independence, Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and the United States Colored Troops. And that is something that I'm particularly interested in, having studied the Civil War, you know, in the past. So, you know, it's about how African Americans earn their freedom, and then how that concept of freedom was shaped over time based upon past experiences. So. Tonight we are very lucky to have Dr. Tonya Taylor tonight to talk about this, and you know, she is an accomplished scholar, you know, elected school board member, and I had to bring the notes specifically for this, as Associate Professor of American History for Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, West Chester University campus. So she is also a Frederick Douglass Scholar, and on the co-chair of the Coatesville Historical Commission, and we're very honored to work with them in the past as well. And you know, she you know, would be remiss if I didn't mention, you know, that you know, most of her experiences, like so many of us, are shaped by your family, and particularly your grandmother and the experiences there. So I know that you're working on lynching and how that shapes American experience. So tonight, without further ado, Dr. Taylor and Fighting for Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the use of United States Colored Troops. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. And I also would like to thank CTV, 3ctvlive.com for taping this. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and I'm going to tell you something that's very interesting. When I first came in, I was basically saying, okay, and I'm going to bring this up. When I first, I'm from Mississippi, and so when we learned about the Underground Railroad, we learned it as a criminal enterprise that denied people their property, okay? And so for the most part, then I get here and get here from Mississippi, and this is just, I have to bring this up, is that I get in from Mississippi, and the first face that I see when I stepped in Pennsylvania a decade ago is here tonight. Marianne is here, and she was over with a Frederick Douglass scholar. Well, she was helping and assisting with the Frederick Douglass Scholar Program. And so, you know, that was Marianne's first face that I saw. And then the next thing you know, I joined a family, and I learned about this man, Solomon Butcher, who was in the 25th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. And so what happens is, and I'm like, so what? Hold on. You all celebrate the Underground Railroad? That was my first thing that I had to get my hands around. Because for the most part, again, growing up as a Southerner and learning that the Civil War was the war of Northern aggression, okay? Growing up, hearing that type of piece, you're like, oh my goodness, you know, you all celebrate that. And then turn around, because I was born and reared in the South, we really didn't necessarily, even in our textbooks, things that was stressed, and I actually studied Southern culture at the University of Mississippi, and we really didn't stress United States Colored Troops. So when I got here and in front of, when I arrived in Pennsylvania, and then I went to Franklin Institute, and I saw this, it's a statue in front of Franklin Institute that basically is a celebration of a memorial to the United States Colored Troops. And so, you know, time went by, and I got more and more vested into the Underground Railroad, and that investment basically took me to the understanding of the United States Colored Troops. Again, because what happens is that some of these people who were on the Underground Railroad would actually be people who would serve in the United States Colored Troops. And so it's just been a very, when you sort of full circle, if you will. And one of the things that stood out to me this past year, before I get started with my presentation, what happens is last year, I brought up Solomon Butcher because we were actually in Mercersburg. As a Pennsylvania humanities scholar, I went to various places, and that includes Carlisle, Chambersburg, Philadelphia, and Mercersburg was one. And Mercersburg has a cemetery that has quite a number of African-American United States colored troops. And so it was there that I found out that the United States colored troops, one of the reasons that I did not learn about them was because for the most part after the war, the United States government didn't recognize them. And their formal celebration of the Civil War veterans. They met down in D.C., but they didn't invite the United States colored troops. So it was a group of women in Harrisburg, a group of black women in Harrisburg that said that, guess what? We want to basically honor our troops and their contribution. And so sitting in Mercersburg, a person who was, over there was thinking about conceiving the program, they said, so what do you know about the United States colored troops? I said, outside of the dedication program, and that Anthony, my husband, is a family member in one. He has a family member who was one. I really don't know that much. But that voyage and that chance conversation took me on a trip that I have, I now hold to be invaluable. Because what happens is, and I'm going to finish the story about the women at the women who met in Harrisburg, what they did was that they called these men, and these men came, and they actually were recognized. And so from that recognition, the second part of that story is that 100 voices, it was 100 voices that a year ago, last year, they basically recreated that program in celebration of the United States colored troops. They basically did an anniversary program in Harrisburg. And one of the folks, one of the young men, they had troops there, and one of the young men basically was Anthony's ancestor. And basically he had this flag as he went on, and this is where the story of United States colored troops, the women who basically honored them after the American Civil War, and then they did this program last year. And it was a very, touching program, because what they want and the call for us to do was to go to the cemeteries and place wreaths, put flowers and wreaths on their graves. And so I visited many cemeteries doing that. And here in Cokesville, we have quite a few. And one of them is actually up in Ursulton. And so what happens is now when I go past cemeteries, I always look for the United States colored troop. And it's a full circle again, because when I first came here, I had no knowledge of them. And so basically, in many ways, that sort of gives a segue into my presentation. Even though this is called Fighting for Freedom, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is enough already. You're going to hear me say that constantly. Enough already. Enough already. And that becomes the rallying cry for those people who were at one time 3/5 of a human being in one area, or most definitely secondary citizens in 3/5 of a human being when it comes down to the Constitution, and a marginalized person in the American North. Now, before we get started, I want to sort of give a context to this. Frederick Douglass, basically was writing in the Douglass Monthly in 1863, in April. And he said, the white man's soul was tried in 1776. The black man's soul is being tried in 1863. When I read that as a scholar a few years ago, it was almost like a eureka moment, if you will, because I was able to finally connect this idea of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence and what I had been told as an important document, the Emancipation Proclamation. So you say, well, how does this happen? And it goes back to something that we're actually currently going on here at the Smithsonian. Now, there is a Thomas Jefferson, we're not going to have a huge conversation on Jefferson, but I think it becomes very telling to sort of start this conversation out with the Declaration of Independence. Who was the principal architect of that Declaration of Independence, and what did that Declaration of Independence say? So now we have this, right now what's going on, it opened on the 27th, it's at the Smithsonian, And it's talking about slavery at Jefferson's Monticello and the paradox of freedom, paradox of liberty. In many ways, Thomas Jefferson, why he is very much relevant, still relevant in so many conversations, is because Thomas Jefferson represents the way, in many ways, represents America on the issue of slavery, on the issue of liberty, on the issue of freedom. Now, what do you mean by that, Thames Taylor? What I mean by that is that you have Thomas Jefferson was conflicted on self-interest versus common good. Well, let's just go through this for a second. I'm going to click links that's connected to my website. Okay, and so one of the pieces here that I'm going to have to move over here. Okay, one of the pieces here that we sort of looking at, they're talking about the exhibits that's actually at the at Monticello. And of course, DNA evidence helped to do several things. DNA evidence helped to sort of situate the Hemmings family and connect it with Monticello. And at this, at the National Museum, at the Smithsonian, they have a connection. They have a companion website, and that's where we're going to go to next. And this companion website is Slavery at Monticello. Okay. And what happens is it sort of goes on and it talks about, and it asks a very important question, one that sort of helps me to sort of frame our discussion that we're going to have today. How could the author of the Declaration of Independence own slaves? How could 20% of the population of this new United States, founded on the principles of liberty and equality, live in bondage? What was life like for enslaved people in the new republic? And as you sort of go on and we sort of get through, and I'm going to go through part of the piece, and again, Jefferson represents a larger conversation that the American Civil War would help to answer. Here's Jefferson. Let's just look at the blurb here. Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. He wrote the Virginia Statute on religious freedom. He served the nation. He helped create as a minister of France, Secretary of State, Vice President, and President. He founded the University of Virginia and contributed to many fields of scholarship. He consistently opposed slavery, calling it moral depravity, yet over the course of his lifetime, he would own 600 people. His way of life also depended upon the labor of the people that he held in slavery. I'm going to pause there because let's go to enough already. And going back to what Douglass said in 1776 about the white man's soul being tried, and then in 1863, the black man's soul being tried. So let me just give you a little backdrop. When we look at the military set records of the United States Colored Troop and how many of them worked and served in the military, you have 185,000. That includes the officers. Yet and still their story is not known. So the question now becomes, there's two questions and two folds. What happens here in 1776, and then what happens in 1863? Okay. We're going to get started a little bit on Jefferson. I'm going to go to the next link, which is here. Okay. It's coming up, hopefully. If not, I know how to navigate it. Okay. Jefferson is, let's just go to his anti-slavery action. All right. So we basically find this man, Jefferson, basically, again, looking at some of the issues. Jefferson was very conflicted. In many ways, what he wanted to do was that he wanted to end this idea of slavery. He wanted to end this system of slavery, but his whole lifestyle depended upon this system of slavery. And so what happens is, because his lifestyle depended upon this system of slavery, we basically end up finding Jefferson in turmoil. You have him who basically, on one hand, believing that it was going to have a gradual emancipation, and then you have another hand where basically his lifestyle is dependent upon it. Okay, it's taking me back. Just one sec. There was a, I'll get to this link, to sort of tell you how full circle this story comes out, an understanding of how Jefferson sort of fits in, and how this enough already and this paradox in America, in many ways he shows this conflict between personal interest and global good. There was a descendant of one of the slaves that Jefferson owned. The family, he was part of the Hemings family. The Hemings family that's basically been connected to the Jefferson family through DNA. And what happens is that this particular person, descendant of Jefferson perhaps, or most definitely someone in his family, what happens is that he basically claims his freedom in 1864 when Union forces occupied the town. Now he would eventually accompany and he would eventually join the United States Infantry in Wheeling, Virginia, and then he would join the 25th Regiment, and then he would also go into the Black Corps. Now, why this story is important is that here you are, you have the principal framer of the Declaration of Independence, who writes, and this is beautiful language. The Declaration has some of the most beautiful language in it. I teach it as a document. I'm not going to read the part about we hold these truths to be self-evident. But basically, I'm going to read the part that I am going to read about, and I'm going to enlarge it here for us, is the piece here becomes very important, and that's why I'm saying enough already, is that prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And then it goes down a little bit when you read the document, and this is actually my favorite part of the Declaration of Independence, where it says it is their right and it is their duty to throw off such government. Now, I brought up the Edmund story, the story that was right before George Edmund, because for the most part, being a descendant of slave that was owned on Jefferson's plantation, what you find of, or Monticello, what you find is that he basically still had this idea to throw off and give that yoke that was, it was his right and it was his duty to throw off such government. Now, when we look at the story of blacks in America, what we find is that blacks actually tried to throw off constantly their yoke. They're really living in two states. You have blacks living in the North, and then you have the bulk of blacks living in the American South. Now, in the American South, they tried to throw off the yoke by various ways, not in the ways of rebellion like we sort of think about, but they threw off the yoke in the terms of like vengeance, sickness, breaking tools, slowing down the workforce when it comes down to singing songs that would basically do a melody very slow. They had their own naming practices and the like sort. So in many ways, they were trying to throw off that system and refuse to be the chattel slavery that they were called in the Constitution, that 3/5 of a human. And then in the American North, they would do the same thing by trying to, form organizations, trying to work and the like sort. So when we look at this visionary document, I teach that the Declaration of Independence is a vision. The Constitution is the law in the founder making. But the Declaration of Independence is the vision. It says we have a right to exist because we have a right to exist. We have a right to be because we have a right to be. And once we basically have a legitimate grievance, we have the right to throw off yoke. That is no different than the document, one of the principal documents I'm going to talk about tonight in the Emancipation Proclamation. But let me sort of give you some of the background between 1776 and Jefferson being sort of the embodiment, because in his lifetime he would own over 600 slaves, and because of the debt that his place would have, the only people who would be emancipated would be the Hemings family. But what happens is that, so let me give you some backdrop. So between 1776, and then we have another major decision in the 1830s, the Missouri Compromise. But the first civil rights movement would take place between 1850 and 1860. Okay? So I'm giving you some drops. And so, and one of the principal pieces that happened in 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, or the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, what that law did was, again, we are a republic. And as a republic, we're governed by laws. Now, what the Fugitive Slave Act did was basically make every white person in America a slave catcher. I'm going to pause there so you'll get it. That it made every white person in America a slave catcher, because what it did was it said that it was the obligation of each citizen to basically help the person acquire their property back. Okay? And then the next major decision came in 1857. And this was a case of called the Frederick, Dred Scott decision. In the nutshell, Dred Scott basically sued for his freedom, and the decision that was made by a Judge Taney, was that basically that, and this is the last sentence, that state citizenship did not permit an individual to bring a suit to federal court, and it barred the United States Constitution that defined blacks as a subordinate and inferior class of being. So what this decision did, the Dred Scott decision of 57, it basically said that, and Taney said it in his own arguments, that blacks had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. I'm going to pause there, and I want you to sort of think about it. So now you have this Declaration of Independence, and now you have these light and transient causes, people having a duty and the right. You have resistance always. Resistance from the first time that African Americans, when they were on the plantation in various ways they were, and even, you know, I always a kid with my students, when I say this question, who was the first abolitionist? And the answer is always some proper noun. Oh, was it Wendell Phillips? No. Mm-mm. Was it William Lloyd Garrison? No. Mm-mm. So who was the first abolitionist? Or who were the first abolitionists? The slaves, the ones who actually ran away. They were the first abolitionists. They were the reason for that story, the Underground Railroad that I told you. That enterprise could not have existed if slaves were not willing to, the enslaved was not willing to run. And so you find them resisting along the way. And so what happens is, so what Taney's court said was that they had no rights that a white man was bound to respect, and that they were in a inferior or subordinate and inferior class of being. Well, there was a man in 1819, he basically, you know, he did some things in Kansas, and then he went to Harper's Ferry in 1859, and he basically did a siege. His name was John Brown. Now, John Brown, of course, in American history is depicted as this insane madman. But can I tell you something? You will not find one critical voice of John Brown in African American history. I don't care if you look for it in a microscope. Even Malcolm X said, I don't have much cause to study or even admire a black man saving John Brown. Okay? And so what happens is that, in fact, I grew up, and I'm going to pause for a second. I thought John Brown was black until I got into college. Because in our community, in the African American Southern community, you'll hear two things. People will say this, well, I'll be John Brown. That means it was something good. It was something great. That's if you're a black Southerner. If you hear a white Southerner say it, for example, a flattening of the tire or something, they'll say, well, I'll be John Brown. So it was this idea of how you interpreted John Brown. So, of course, when you hear two groups of people interpreting it differently, I just naturally thought that John Brown was a black man until I got to college and saw a picture of him. Okay, because, again, growing up in the American South, they didn't necessarily, you know, focus on John Brown. And so what happens is, what we have is that we have John Brown. He has his raid. And in many ways, according to one historian, David Reynolds, he believed that that sort of set off the cause of the Civil War, that actually his raid on Harper's Ferry sparked the war and was actually the first battle. Now, before we get to what happens when the war kicks off, I'm going to explain Lincoln, because one of the theses that I want you to take away from here, one of the major arguments, is that black people were not sitting around twiddling their thumbs and saying, please, Master Lincoln, come and free us. They weren't doing that. Nor that Abraham Lincoln, just like any man, had to grow in age, grace, and wisdom. And so what happens is that when he was first elected, a man by the name of Frederick Douglass was very skeptical of Lincoln. In fact, he didn't see Lincoln as an ally at all. And so what happens is that, and as Douglass and Lincoln is sort of going back, and they have a rich relationship that in a few minutes I'm going to talk about. But during this time, the war is now kicked off, and you have these people who, by the United States, the Taney's Court and Dred Scott decision, basically said that blacks were not protected by the Constitution and never could they be the citizens. So let me say exactly what Dred Scott did, so you get to know exactly why it's important to know the United States colored troops. Okay, for the most part, Dred Scott decision was a ruling by the United States Supreme Court that people of African descent brought into the United States and held as slaves and their descendants, whether or not citizens, could not be protected by the Constitution and were not citizens. Now, why is that important to know? Because now you have, and this is something that I try to get people to get to understand this when we look at the Emancipation Proclamation, why it's so important. Here you have, at this particular period, in this nation that was half slave and half free. In this nation that was basically saying liberty. One of the major terms that were used during the American Revolution was liberty. Liberty, 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 and slavery. So you have this piece, and you have this half slave, half free, and now you have this legal judicial decision that's saying that these people were not citizens. Nor were they protected by the protections of the Constitution. And then Taney even goes so far as to argue that that the authors of the Constitution had viewed all blacks as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. And again, he gives his famous decisions, his famous words, that they had no white rights in which a white man was bound to respect. So here you have in 57, you have these men, or you have these people who are not considered citizens. Now, basically, not only did it help the caste of blacks who were slaves, but it also impacted the citizenship of those who were living in free areas, because for the most part, they didn't have the protections of the Constitution. So as they were going in before the courts, what you start to see is their rights being minimized. And so it was only made sense then that black people as a whole would support John Brown. And they did fund his his campaign. In fact, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman was supposed to be with John Brown. But then what happened with Harriet Tubman got sick. And then here's a piece about John Brown and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass met John Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And they talked for hours in a quarry. John Brown was living under assumed name. He wasn't living under John Brown in Chambersburg. So basically they met in this quarry, met for hours. Frederick Douglass had brought a black man with him by the name of Shields Green. They're sitting there going for hours. So Frederick Douglass initially was supposed to be with Brown, right? Remember I told you that but what Brown did in Chambersburg was switch his plan up and say that I'm not going to, because John Brown's original plan was that we're going to travel down south, and as we travel down south, we're going to basically help to liberate plantation by plantation, and we can go and live in maroons. Pretty much he was influenced by West Indian politics. So we're going to go and do that. Black people as a whole supported him. Okay, they gave him money. Oh, they was with him. And then John Brown got to Chambersburg and decided that what he wanted to do was that he wanted to raid Harper's Ferry. Frederick Douglass tried to talk him out of it by telling him that he was going into a perfect steel trap. But for the most part, John Brown was determined to go. Again, there was a black man by the name of Shields Green, and this tells you the importance of John Brown, and it goes back to how he helped people to define their citizenship and why there's no critical voice of him in African American history. Okay, so what happens is that black man, here's Shields Green. He's with Frederick Douglass. right? He's with Douglass. He's now with the, internationally known Douglass. Douglass now have gone to England. He's gone to Ireland. Where haven't Frederick Douglass gone? Okay? He is one of the most recognizable figures, if not the most recognizable American abroad. I didn't say black American. I said American. Well, then Taney's decision, he doesn't necessarily have that much citizenship, right? Okay, so what happens is, so here is Shields Green. He's with Frederick Douglass, right? Yeah. He came in with Douglass, and then next thing you know, Shields Green was sitting around here. Now, who is Shields Green? Esau Brown, whatever names he wanted to go by, but namely Shields Green. So here's Shields Green, a person whose family was sold away from him. Well, he was, regularly, routinely beaten, and his family was sold away from him, and that's what made him ran away. That's what made him seek freedom. He finds his freedom. He goes to New York. He's in New York. Frederick Douglass comes from Rochester down through Philadelphia. Then he goes to goes to New York. Goes to Philadelphia, and then goes to Chambersburg. So you have Shields Green with him, his companion. After listening to Douglass and John Brown go at it for 3 hours, Frederick Douglass said, well, I told you you're going to a steel trap, I'm gone. And so he's leaving, and Shields Green is sitting there. And Shields Green says, Frederick Douglass said, hey, old man, hey, Shields, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to stay with the old man. Here's a black man who came with a black man, two black men who knew slavery. But whatever John Brown was putting down in that quarry that day, he convinced one black man to stay with him. Shields Green would go on to be in Harper's Ferry along with 5 others. And Shields Green would basically had an opportunity to escape along with Osborne Anderson, who ended up coming through Westchester actually. But what happens is Shields Green had an opportunity to escape, and he turned around and they said, Shields, what are you doing? You can go, you can leave. This is what Osborne Anderson's account is. You can leave, come, let's go. Come, I'm leaving, right? And so Shields Green said, I came with the old man and I'm going to die with the old man. I'm telling you that example of Shields Green very early on because it tells you something about how bad black people wanted freedom. He's very representative of the spirit that you're going to see in this 3rd Regiment, the 25th Regiment, and the slew of regiments of black regiments. He was basically looking for an opportunity. And John Brown, while Frederick Douglass made up his mind not to go and fight, like Frederick Douglass himself said, I would live for the slave, John Brown would die for him. And basically, Shields Green, when he saw that, he was like, basically, hey, you're giving me an opportunity to fight for freedom for black and former slaves. I'm going to take that route. So now you have this story. There's a story within that story. You have 2 former slaves. One decided that they wanted to go and they wanted to fight for freedom physically. The other wanted to fight for freedom how? Let's go through the legislative part. And Frederick Douglass himself admit that's what he was going to do. And that's what he did. So now we go on, and so we got to the point where we're in 61. Now the minute that black folks start, the war kicks off, basically John Brown braids scares Southerners, then the election of Lincoln scares Southerners even more. What ended up happening is that now they're ready to go at it, they're ready to leave the Union. So as they get ready to leave the Union, and now we have the first battles that come out, immediately in 1861, Congress had to try to address something. Because as these after Bull Run, what we start to see is that many of these black these black slaves were doing what? They were escaping to Union lines. Very early on. Why is that important? First of all, it basically throws all of these notions into the idea that, blacks were waiting for Master Lincoln, right? And so what happens is that very early on, blacks are now running to these Union lines, so much so that they don't know what to do with them. So they passed something called the First Confiscation Act, Okay, and basically what it did, you know, was just really reinstate the international law that you can seize any property from the Confederacy and use it to the war effort. Now the Second Confiscation Act would come again and it would have that same piece, but it permitted the United States government to seize all the real and personal property of anyone taking arms up against the government. Okay, and so now during that time in 62, where you have this Second Confiscation Act, you have something happening in Louisiana. Even before 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation being passed, even before that time, you had some regiments of African Americans that were raised in New Orleans. So as early as fall of 1863, you have the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard. Okay, they would end up going on, and they would these units would later become the 1st and 2nd, the 3rd Infantry, and they would go on to form the 76th, 74th, and 75th United States Colored Troops. So what you have very early on, I'm going to show you this particular piece. At an incident called Port Houston, and I'm going to bring, Hudson. I'm bringing this up for a reason because it's going to impact Douglas in a second. But what happens is at Port Hudson, which is the longest siege in American history, it lasted for 48 days. What you basically find here is that you have blacks who are in this regiment, all right, and they're basically helping to secure this fort from the Confederates. And I'll just let you read this for yourself. It says here the Confederates advanced across the Sumter, killing approximately 2,000 Union soldiers. Union casualties included 600 African Americans of the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards. Free blacks from New Orleans composed a majority of the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, including line officers. Former slaves commanded by white officers composed the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard. So what you have here is even before the war effort is even kicking off, even before they got permission to go and fight for war, even before they were even seen as citizens, because at this time they were not citizens, here you have African Americans dying for a cause. You have them forming their own regiments, demanding their own freedom. Now I'm going to go back to that document on 1776. How is it that you now have a legitimate grievance? You have a legitimate charge, and in this case, in the Declaration of Independence, it was against King George. Here these people are having a legitimate grievance against the system of slavery, and they're going and they're fighting against slavery any opportunity that they get. It can be from running away as being abolitionists, or it can be in serving in something that's, guess what, not supported by the United States government yet. But that's not the only case that happened here. Again, they would go into documents. We have another case, would be at Milton's Bend, okay? Another parish in Louisiana. All right? When basically we sort of look at what was the casualties. The major pieces for this Milton's Bend is that, as you can see, the forces that are engaged is the African Brigade and the 23rd Iowa Volunteer Infantry. Okay, now what would happen and why this is important to sort of know is because when Lincoln signs that magic document, I hear now people basically talking about how the Emancipation Proclamation meant nothing. It didn't free one slave. It is actually irrelevant. This document means nothing. And I tell them that's something you're reading back in history. Well, sidebar real quick. In African American communities to this day, just a few weeks ago, let's say about 5 weeks ago, right? There was something on December the 31st that was held at some black churches, and that was called Watch Night, right? Watch Night is this, they call it Watch Night in the church. And what happens is on December the 31st, what you have in African American churches throughout this country, yesterday and today, or most definitely since 1863, is that black people were waiting around. And when January the 1st, 1863, they were waiting around on December the 31st, 1862, and when on January the 1st, 1863 rolled around, they started jumping up and standing and happy for joy. Now, you may say, But what does that document mean? Because here's one of these strange ironies in American history, just like the ignoring of the United States color troops. Here is a document that people are actually taking for exactly what it is. They don't see the vision of that document. They don't even make the document very similar to the energy that was associated around the Declaration of Independence. When Frederick Douglass read the document, Lincoln's draft, and let me just tell you a little bit about Lincoln's draft. 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln he's going through all this blood at Antietam, Antietam being the 5th bloodiest war in the Civil War. He's going through all this blood. Imagine, all these people have died. And basically every time he's stepping his foot, he's basically, if you get if you get rainwater, if you get the grass and it's very wet, and you can, hear the squish of the water. At Antietam, it was the squish of blood and the stench. So Abraham Lincoln's there, and it was there that he decided, and he had, it's a backdrop with this story, and I'm going to just indulge in 2 seconds. The backdrop is that Lincoln said, if I get a decisive victory, and Antietam really wasn't a decisive victory, but he said, if I get a decisive victory, what I'll do is I will issue this proclamation. So he looked at Antietam, decided it was decisive victory for the North, or victory for the North, and then that's when he issues out this emancipation. When Frederick Douglass read the words, forever free, he said, this is the greatest document ever signed by the United States President. And now what you have is that people say the document did nothing. The document, the Emancipation Proclamation, basically, now despite its expansive wording, I'll just give you a little bit of what I've written here. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of a bloody battle. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, it captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of Americans and fundamentally transformed the character of the war. After January 1st, 1863, every advance of federal troops expanded the domain of freedom. Moreover, the proclamation announced the acceptance of black men into the Union Army and Navy, enabling the liberated to become the liberators. By the end of the war, like I said, almost 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and for freedom. Now, this is the sad irony of American history. You have these people who have this wonderful document. I teach that there are 3 major documents in American history. The Declaration of Independence, which is a vision. The Constitution, which is the shaping and the laws that's going to govern that vision. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which allows black people to now that it actually handles the issues that were unresolved with the Constitution. And what you'll see is that this document is symbolic as some people think it is and say it is. This document, this one document with having the terms forever free, would be used as a rallying cry, and it would basically, what you would see after that document, this is what you end up having the result of. Come on. It'll be coming up in a second, I didn't. You now start to see all of these regiments, and they'll come up in a second. Actually, Solomon Butcher trained at Camp William Penn outside of Philadelphia. Now what you start to see is all of these regiments that would actually come about. Now it's very interesting because now they have a movie that's, in the Red Tails and some of the Tuskegee Airmen, But what happens is that you would have all of these regiments that would actually get started. And the 25th Regiment, the regiment that Solomon Butcher would belong to, would not actually be disbanded until the end of the World War II, when they ended segregation in the military, period. But the 25th Regiment would go on and live with it through that time. So here you are, you having this wonderful document. Now, what did Frederick Douglass do? And I'm just going to sort of read a little bit from Douglass himself, because I think it's more telling than what I can do. And then I'll open it up to questions. So Frederick Douglass, he meets with Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so several things happens here. Okay, first of all, Frederick Douglass did not like Abraham Lincoln at all. He didn't really care that much about him. And so what happens is he goes and he tells so the first time that Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln meet, Douglass goes in. This is the days when you can just go to the White House and wait for the president. And so what happens is that, they hear that Frederick Douglass is outside. Abraham Lincoln hears that Frederick Douglass is waiting outside. And he said, Fred Douglass? Fred Douglass? So then he says, really, Fred Douglass is out there? Tell him I said, come on in. And by Lincoln's own account, when he was trying to, okay, should I lie like this? I mean, that's how Lincoln was saying, he was just trying to compose himself of how do you meet, because Douglass was a major critic. So anyway, when Douglass goes in the room, Douglass now picks up the account of, Lincoln's piece. And so Lincoln is sitting there, he said, I'll lounge back in the chair. You can sort of imagine the scene. And so they have their first conversation. And then their second conversation would come because Abraham Lincoln was thinking about having and passing the Emancipation Proclamation, and he would be going against members of his party, and he actually sought the advice of Frederick Douglass. And then the next one would come, and Frederick Douglass would also give advice to Lincoln about letting the black men serve in the military. But here's the case, and give you a grand example how their relationship shaped up. At his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln saw Frederick Douglass in the crowd. He didn't know that John Wilkes Booth was there, but it's a one picture that we have of Lincoln talking. John Wilkes Booth is there, and you can see him. But anyway, what happens is that he saw Frederick Douglass in the crowd, and he gave his second inaugural address. And then basically at the end of that night at his inauguration party, he basically sees Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass had to do a lot of things to get in because they didn't want to come in. But, he ended up getting in, so that's a whole story within itself. But he ended up getting in, and so he said, Fred, come over here, Fred. So Douglass walks over there, and Frederick Douglass was known for I don't know how sincere this modesty was, okay? And that's why everybody sort of talk about it. So he said, Fred, come over. He said, Fred, what did you think about my address? Frederick Douglass, I don't want to. I'll just write about this later on. I'll send you a letter. He said, no, Fred. Don't you know that out of all the men in this room, now this is a room full of state senators, people in politics, influential men. He said, out of all the men in this room, I respect you the most. In many ways, that story and that account sort of exemplifies what Frederick Douglass also did in this piece. So, of course, he told John Brown, no, you're going into a perfect steel trap. But then Frederick Douglass also went about, and he served as a recruiter for the United States colored troops. And what happens is that on something called Call for Men, it's a nice poster that says Men of Color to Arms, and he brings up the two incidents, the Milton's Bend and the Port Hudson, and he says, it is your responsibility to come and to fight as men. And Douglass said, these are the reasons why you should fight, is that although you are colored men, you are not, if you were only a horse or an ox incapable of deciding whether the rebels are right or wrong, you would have no responsibility and might, like the horse or the ox, go on eating your corn and get corn and grass in total indifference as to what side of victorious or vanquished of this conflict. He said another reason that you should fight is because you are, however, not only a man but an American citizen. So he was basically giving them citizenship. A third reason that you should fight, to basically prove every Negro hater and slavery lover in the land regards to arming the Negroes as a calamity. It's the best way to prevent it. And then he also said you should enlist to learn the use of arms, to become familiar with the means of securing and preparing and defending your own liberty. He also says you are a member, the fifth reason, you are a member of a long enslaved and despised race. The next reason, whether you are or are not entitled to all the rights of citizenship in this country, have long been a matter of dispute to your prejudice. By enlisting in the service of your country at this very hour and upholding the national flag, you stop the mouths of those and you win applause from the lips of those from the iron lips of ingratitude. And number 7, enlist for your own sake so you can have your own self-respect. Number 8, you should enlist because doing so will be one of the most certain means of preventing the country from drifting back to the whirlpool of pro-slavery compromise at the end of the war. And number 9, you should enlist because the war for the Union, whether men so-called or not, this is the war for emancipation. And basically, Frederick Douglass also said that, therefore, nobody can tell your family and your children that somebody set you free and somebody gave you your freedom because you fought for it. But American history has been cruel in the sense that they did not look at what the United States colored troops and why this Civil War is so important, this 150th anniversary. The Civil War settled the question that the American Revolution did not in regards to understanding freedom. 1. 2. The Civil War answered the question of what would be the status of black people in America. Okay? And number 3, it would basically be a continuation of black people and how they had fought for freedom continuously from the plantation, right, to those in the north area. They fought. And nobody gave it to them. They weren't sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They basically interrogated a nation that had said that they were people who were 3/5 human as far as the South is concerned. And as far as Taney's court was concerned, they interrogated this idea that they weren't citizens because they went and they fought like they were citizens. And so basically what you have in this story is a very American story. You have this story of saying enough already. Enough already for injustice. Enough already for tyranny. Enough already for oppression. Enough already. Their story is right along the lines of the people who basically fought in the American Revolution. They fought in the American Revolution. And so then they continued to fight in every major battle that we had in this country. Even when they were not deemed citizens and protected under the civil right, under the Constitution, and were not given initially fair wages, they still fought. They still ran to Union lines. And yet and still, history have done a cruel injustice to them. Because just like I did not know the story of the United States colored troops, and I did not know, and I learned the story of abolitionists, and now abolitionists are seen in the lines of Quakers. No offense to any Quakers in the room, but you know that's the story, not abolitionists from the people for slaves. And at that moment, an injustice has been done. And now people tell them, don't you know Abraham Lincoln set the slaves free? Now, and that's a cruel line of injustice, because the framers of the Constitution and those patriots, see, they fought for their freedom. And now that freedom, because they fought for it, because they earned it, there's a whole different level than when somebody gave it to you. And now you can understand in the shaping of how a citizenship, one group of citizenship, or one folk's citizenship is always seen secondary. Because don't you know, Abraham Lincoln set them free. They didn't earn it. It was benevolence. And so when we sort of look at the Civil War, which did settle the question of the American Revolution, and we look at all the pieces that came before, Dred Scott to even be in the courtroom to have Taney say that there was no rights that a white man was bound to respect, you still had a man who went to court to interrogate the system. They interrogated the system just like those people who wrote down and put things down, the grievances against King George. They listed their grievance. They listed their grievance when they ran away. They listed their grievance when they basically said, what? You said what? We're not going to be free? We're going to have to go to Canada? Then that's what we're going to do. They listed their grievance. They listed their grievance every step of the way. Every step they were listing their grievance. And then when they were not citizens, they still said, guess what? In order to secure this freedom, to preserve this union, we're going to join this side. And history been cruel to them, because history doesn't even tell their story. And have their children believing that Abraham Lincoln set them free. If there are any questions, thank you so much. Are there any questions you may have? Going back to the paradox of liberty and looking at, in many ways, what Thomas Jefferson's, idea of when we sort of look at, this idea of self-interest versus communal good. Here are these soldiers who were not even looking at self-interest. They were totally looking at communal good. Community good. They were totally looking for it, because if they were just looking at for self-interest, they were underpaid. Now they served, and I'm going to let you have, there's a rich story with the United States colored troops. And I promise you right now, there is not one major battle in the Civil War that was won. Even when you're talking about the sieges and the siege of, when you're looking at Savannah, and when you look, it's not one in Atlanta, the burning Sherman down in Atlanta. There's not one major battle. Even at Gettysburg, and Gettysburg having to come together with their history, but even at Gettysburg, you're not going to have one battle that was not helped. The United States colored troops did not help to influence the turn and the victorious win for the Union. Every major battle, the United States colored troops were either in the rear or they were already at the forefront. I promise you, if you go and look at the documents yourself, because I can't go into their battles because that's a whole different lecture within itself. I'm looking at the documents and how the documents of 1776, there is no difference between the document of 1776 in the Vision for a Nation than the Emancipation Proclamation. What the Declaration of Independence did for its white citizens, the Emancipation Proclamation did for its blacks. And that's why it's important. And that's why it was finished business.
I just have a question, and I was under the assumption that the African American troops, the colored troops, that did not get to actually have guns in their hands until after the Emancipation Proclamation. So from what I learned, I spent a summer, a week in the summer, 2 summers ago, as a Lincoln Fellow. So when we were, when in one of the lectures, and I may, not have this correct, but I was under the assumption that that guns were not put into their hands until after the Emancipation Proclamation, because before that, the African Americans that came to the Army were used to drive wagons and to cook, and so they were used in all these domestic ways because, number one, they wanted to be there, and the Army embraced them, but they didn't know what to do with them. And so they put them to use, in as many different ways as possible, but would not let them rise up with arms. So I'm kind of interested, like I didn't realize that these other regiments existed before, the Emancipation Proclamation.
Now, that's why I basically brought up in this call for arms, one of the things that they talk about is, again, these two incidents. Now, it's many ways, in theory, you have these pieces that are, in theory, but in actuality, like Port Hudson and also Milton's Bend show us that no, from the very beginning, blacks had weaponry. And can I tell you something, even there, even when they went down to the American South, see, we have to understand the beautiful piece about blacks serving in the Civil War. This is where sometimes their black skin, in this case, would help them out. What do you mean by that? Somebody like Harriet Tubman, who did receive a pension from the government. People don't know that. She received the United States pension from the government. But Harriet Tubman, because blacks were so common on the Union side, but they were also so common on the Confederate side, that they were able to do what? Constantly go back and forth. And that's why they made wonderful spies. Because for the most part, with the Confederates, they weren't necessarily telling, John's boy to get away when they were basically, making their pieces. And because again, John's boy was there to, dig the trenches, cook the foods, make sure that the regiment, cavalry was taken care of. And so basically, you have black people when they're crossing over in these Union lines, and then they're going back going back south. Harriet Tubman was a master at doing it because the black body was so present at most definitely on the Confederate side. Right? And then also because, as they would basically be advancing, you wouldn't know if these people, these slaves, been told by their masters that they need to come and help you out and so on and so forth. We know that the documents are replete with black people given, when the Yankees first came in, they knew exactly when the Yankees are first coming in. And so here you are, you having these black bodies able to go on Union side and also able to go on the Confederate side. That goes back to an incident like this, where the minute they basically saw, in most definitely Louisiana, they actually started to form their areas and their regiments as early as 1861 with their confiscation acts. And then most definitely they're in two decisive wars in 62. And so that's when black people, Frederick Douglass them and Octavia Cato, when they were organizing these people in different parts of, in different states, they were like, remember your brothers at Port Hudson, remember your brothers at Milton's Bend. So they were basically right on saying, look, they're fighting and the like sort. So what happens is when the first Northern Regiment would get started, which is the 54th in Massachusetts, when they would get started, now you basically, and then a movie like Glory, by the way, is 100% inaccurate. There is no, Glory is an inaccurate film. It is not any, first of all, they have the folks not being able to read. Most of those people were literate and college graduates. Right? But people take this Hollywood depiction of these folks and say, what? For the most part, that's the way it was. When you got into some deeper regiments coming down south, you may have had these escapes, these freedom seekers who are now in some of these regiments. But for the most part, no. And just this whole idea of, them not really understanding and comprehending, freedom, it was interesting. If you really want to see the account of, or you really want to read a great account, why don't you go and read Shaw's diary, the person who was over the United States, the 54th Regiment, and see what he says about the folks. And oh, by the way, and read all of their letters, because there are many, because they were writing home. But if you watch a movie like Glory, what you'll get is this idea that somehow this is now the way that these soldiers were. And you also get, this idea, this reluctance or whatever. The arguments normally about pay came when the men, before they enlisted, not during the time when they got in. And so for the most part, but yeah, as early as 62, you have armed regiments. And we have accounts of that. Yeah.
Frederick Douglass, can you recommend a good biography on him? I think Billy or McHenry wrote one some years ago.
Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you that the best, Douglass wrote his own story. He was almost like our current president, who basically, they wrote their own narrative so no one can interpret it, right? So Frederick Douglass has his narrative life of the slave. And so I would suggest that. But then also, here's Foner's selected essays by Douglass, where you really get to see how he grew in age, grace, and wisdom. I mean, Frederick Douglass was a prolific writer. And so I would say pick up a reader on Douglass. It's almost like Martin Luther King. You know, when you meet somebody like Martin Luther King, if you only see him in 57, and 63, and 68, you don't get the full picture. So it's best to basically go to Frederick Douglass's narrative, and then from there pick up him in his Douglass. He had a Douglass weekly. And then because he ran a newspaper in the North Side, then you pick him up in his selected writings. Frederick Douglass would die a millionaire because of his speaking engagements. I got to Westchester University because Frederick Douglass did his last lecture there on the rise of lynching in America. So it's best to read Douglass because, in essence, you know, Douglass tells you how to interpret Douglass. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, but it's, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say thank you very much for your recommendations. Thank you.
Is it anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested in the links that you used for your presentation. Would you be willing to share them?
Oh, yeah, always. What I did was I hope, and I'm trying to make this sort of piece with you, is that, again, I want you to leave here knowing two things. I mean, two major pieces. Is that A, people weren't given their freedom, right? Pretty much like the British. I'm going to probably step on some toes when I say this, but, you know, in essence, the British lost the war. You're now sort of looking at, and I know we like to say Americans won it, but I would like to tell you to go and read 1776 by David McCullough, and he offers a different perspective on pretty much, you sort of look at how in after the war, and now you start to look at how legislation sort of works. So I'm trying to trace how in the Declaration of Independence, in its language, along with the laws of the Republic, which are found in the Constitution, and how the Emancipation Proclamation linked those up, and what happened in between. And I have no problem sharing any of these links, because for the most part, I want the story to get out. Because see, as long as the story remains that black people were given their freedom, you're going to always have the idea that goes back to what Taney said, that somehow they're inferior. That discourse can exist, that they were inferior because they didn't have the innate enough already. Don't do this. Don't mess with me. This is wrong. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, this is not a light and transient cause. As long as the story been told that they didn't have that in them, their citizenship is always up to question and interpretation. And so this story here, and the second thing I want you to leave with is how here's these people who in one region was interrogating the idea of in the laws of the Republic. Now here's Jefferson. He's in conflict. Self-interest, community good. Self-interest, community. Self-interest. Okay, he's in conflict, and it wasn't resolved, right? So now you have someone like these people. You have these enslaved people who are interrogating so much. Remember, property can't talk. Let me just give you an example of this. Goes back to some of the links I want you to start to look at the documents. Property can't talk, right? Can a cow talk? Moo, I guess so, right? But for the most part, they're not going to go into the documents. I mean, they're not going to go into the court documents. We have the legal documents. Our legal system have been influenced by all those slaves the enslaved people cannot go and testify, because remember, their property. What you find is that it is the legal history is replete with examples of one master going to go get another master, or one worker going against a master. When I say worker, meaning someone like an overseer. And what happens is, even though the property cannot talk, the property have created the situation that brought them to the courtroom. And so now what you'll find is, oh, well, Celia or John or Mary, they're now in the documents and they're not even supposed to be there because they're property. It's like a chicken being in documents. They're not supposed to be there, but their actions end up forcing lawsuits that end up impacting the legal system understanding of property. So these folks were constantly interrogating. And what's the difference between them interrogating the system and the folks who were there, the patriots at the very beginning? What was the difference? And that's the piece. That's that missing piece. So, in many ways, I have a good friend who he has a problem with using terms like African American studies and African American history. And I agree with him. Because in essence, this narrative shouldn't be segregated. That's a part of the problem with the history now, why people are giving this and giving that. And in actuality, it's act as if this is somehow a subordinate history that did not influence the larger discourse. And hopefully after today, or after tonight, if you didn't, sort of look at it in this perspective, you're looking at how people influence a larger discourse. And it goes back to that conversation what Lincoln said, who grew in age, grace, and wisdom, right? He basically grew too, because he was a process. Abraham Lincoln was a process, okay? He was a process of an individual. And here's the Lincoln fellow who can verify that, right? He was a person who grew in over time, and it was in his relationships with people like Douglas where he ended up picking up some insight. And it was also his understanding he picked up insight. So just like Lincoln grew, Jefferson was conflicted. Jefferson was conflicted and came up with a lot of pieces and said, hey, look, hope we're going to get rid of this system, but hey, look, I can't get rid of my, my self-interest in the slaves. And then basically Lincoln would actually grow and he would become the same way. And then eventually, you're getting these people who were interrogating. They kept interrogating the system. It's almost like what happened with the American lynching story. People were basically lynching Americans. But people like Ida B. Wells said, hold on, how do you lynch in a land full of laws? How do you do extra-legal violence when we got a judicial system? So what you find is that interrogation at every step of the way. And that makes them what? A part of the story, not some subordinate, segregated version of it. Some people on the periphery who had no influence into the major ideas of American history or the ideas of the Republic. Well, it's just not a good story. It's a tapestry. Pretty much like the people, when you look at the people who were basically there in who was basically fighting for the American Revolution, who had what? Some of them had cloths around their feet because they didn't have shoes. When those enslaved people were seeking freedom, they didn't have shoes either. But it was something said, enough already. Enough. All right, are there any more questions? Please feel free to ask a question. No, so Laura, hopefully, because we're now looking at the United States Color Troop. I have these posters, the Pennsylvania Civil War Trail, again in celebration of the 150th anniversary. They have these out. Here's another piece. The youngest drummer boy in the Civil War is supposed to be 12, but this young man is 8, but he's not in the narrative of the story, okay? And so what happens is, so you have the drummer boy here, and You have in the 12th Regiment, in the 3rd Regiment in the United States Colored Infantry, they said, rather die freemen than live as slaves. Now, if you can remember at the very beginning when when we looked at in 1776, one of the things they said is join or die, and there's this broken up, snake-like. When guess what? The 12th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops said what? Liberty or death. Harriet Tubman in her work said, guess what? She said, She said, I had resolved that I have two things, liberty or death. If I could not have one, then I'll have the other. What's the difference? She was saying enough already, too. So what's the difference between Harriet Tubman, 1776, somebody saying join or die, or then Harriet Tubman saying, or give me liberty, give me death, right? And Harriet Tubman said, if I don't have one, I'm going to have the other. And that's in her that's in her biography. Along with her stories, her Civil War exploits, which are very interesting. And that's why she wanted to join John Brown. But again, she got sick. But John Brown, he basically got the time of the year from Harriet Tubman. Fascinating individual. But she has too been reduced to a former slave and the Moses of her people. They never take her they never take her from being a Moses of her people. They never take Harriet Tubman to basically telling you that she worked for the United States government. They never tell you that she lives a good ripe old age. They never tell you that she's there when basically the formation of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs come about. You never get Harriet Tubman beyond her being the Moses of her people. So it's amazing how the story and the narrative, if you don't sort of get into the documents and then you don't interrogate the documents. So in many ways, I feel so happy to be able to tell this story, and I love history in that regard because it helps me to follow in a tradition, in an American tradition of interrogation.
This is kind of specific, but you mentioned that there were quite a number of colored soldiers that fought in the Civil War here in Coatesville. I know of one family. How do you find out about others?
Military records. That's how we know about Anthony's family. One of the things that they did was the military is very good at sort of keeping its records. And so basically you can find them out in the archives. Sadly, what was happening to the United States Colored Troops record is that no one was going through the documents, so they were deteriorating. And so then what they had to do was they had to look at mustard rolls. But oftentimes you can go to the cemeteries themselves, like right now in East Fallowfield. Some of you may know about it if you're familiar with this area. But in East Fallowfield off of Callan, there is a cemetery there that's overgrown. But it has, I think, is it 13 or like anywhere between, let's say 8 and 13 United States Colored Troops buried there. Is just a cemetery that's unkept. You have up there at at Agland at Mount Zion. I'm going to tell you where you really want to go. If you want to really see some United States Colored Troops graves, go to the AME cemeteries, the African Methodist Episcopal. They're going to normally have a lot of colored troops. If you look at for Pennsylvania, many of these cemeteries are ran by the AME Church. And you basically go in and see it. But for as far as families are concerned, just like with Anthony knew, in fact, he'll kill me when I tell you this, but he was actually telling everybody, yeah, my grandfather fought in the 125th Regiment. Well, there is no 125th Regiment. And so people would be like, what? So we would go down to Harper's Ferry, Gettysburg, where we would go, and he would say initially the 125th, this is not what you usually say, the 125th. He would say the 125th, and they're like, there is no regiment in that way. And so they were able to go in, and that's when he found out, for example, all of his life, he thought they thought that their ancestor had, that Solomon was actually from Kenneth Square, or Westchester, Philadelphia. They thought he was from Philadelphia. But when they basically looked at the rolls to muster him in, right, to basically bring him in, what happens is they found out he was from Lancaster, he was 5'8", he was 21 years old. And they did not know that until they started to look at the records. The family story could have been shaped by the fact that he went to Camp William Penn. And that's what they thought Philadelphia. Yes?
A lady asked a good question about the people fighting in the Civil War at Coastal. Whatever happened to that gravesite. We were trying to look for up in Goose County where we heard there were some possible.
That's what she was talking.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, they're there. It's not even a question if they're there. They're there. It's just a matter of the graves are just unkept in that area.
That graveyard belonged to Hutchinson UAME Church. That's right now down at 825 East Chestnut Street. My church. In fact, we went to purchase it to find out how we could purchase it, and we found out that the county went and sold it to a man in Lancaster, and they had no business selling the graveyard. So now it's private property.
And he'll let you. They'll let you come in because we tried to escort and look at it.
How could they sell something that didn't belong to them?
Well, you talk to the county about that.
Well, are you good with your words?
I'm good. Yeah. I'll leave that to somebody else.
Are there any other questions? I mean, because okay, well, I got something. I have a question. Yeah, I have a question. I would like for at least 3 people to share a takeaway that they're going to take away from this presentation, and they're going to share with someone else. Give a takeaway.
I'm going to look for the graves and look up some of the families.
Wonderful.
I can't wait.
You're going to find it's very interesting. In fact, and I think this is locked out. I think I'm locked out, Sam. So what happens, clicks right here, switch users.
No, click on my name.
Okay. And so what happens is if you go back to Jefferson, what they did was in some of the enslaved families here, they actually went on and you can actually see, for example, you get some of the oral histories that's actually coming from some of the family that's actually in this Smithsonian piece. You get families who basically, that one of the questions that they asked one of the family members is that, did you know your family went to Liberia? And so then they have someone responding back, well, they didn't know, so on and so forth, and just have that discovery about, where their family come from and their ancestry. And so that's one of the pieces that part of the oral history stories and narratives that we're getting now. When we're at, like for example, Anthony experienced that same interview when he sort of found an ancestor, what was his own revelations. There's an article from a magazine, a newspaper called Showcase Now out of Harrisburg, and that was the question that they asked him because he didn't know. So now that you know, how does it impact you? Yes.
If people want to search in the Westchester area, Levi Hood and many others are buried in Chestnut Grove as you're coming into Westchester, where Haley Pike and Route 3 come together on what used to be Hanging Hill there. There's probably over 70 some American veterans in that little cemetery, including a couple of men that served in the Navy. And there were some men in there, a few men that served in the 94th Massachusetts as well.
And actually Anthony's grandfather is buried, and Solomon Butcher is buried in the annex. So he's over by a tree. And it's just very interesting. Let me just tell you the impact of what this did. If you go to Lincoln University sits on top of Hensonville. Hensonville was a black village. Vincentville disappeared when many of the men, it didn't disappear because the land is still there, but the Hensonville, as far as the population, when the men went away and served as quartermasters. So what Lincoln University did when they were basically looking at that area, they basically usurped Hensonville. That's why if you ever go to Lincoln University, there's a church that's right there by the gate. Go and look at the date of that church. The date of that church is the Walls family and the like sort, but you'll see that the date of that church is 1832. If you go to Chester County and look on the map, and I think it's 1852 map, you'll see the village of Hensonville. But just to tell you about some of these hamlets, right, it was never incorporated, so one of the hamlets actually was usurped into Lincoln University, and that's why that church sits there, because that was once a black village. But that the impact of the Civil War impacted that village so, because a lot of the men went out and went out to the war, and then some of them did not come back. Some of them moved into areas. Some of them seized the opportunity that was there for the military, and so the village just basically, Lincoln University ended up serving it.
Henson is what, H-E-N-S-O-N?
Hinsonville, Hensonville. It's a book by John and Peggy Russo. It's called The Village of Hensonville. And so you can get some of these sort of these stories about, exactly the impact. So think about it. We're still trying to get on. We're now getting into the documents and finally seeing the United States colored troops. It's going to be interesting to see how much politics they influence in local areas and local towns and the like sort.
In your searching now, are you coming across any idea of the fatalities? And the reason I'm asking that is because I was working on history in Euclid Township, which is the Downingtown exit of the turnpike is in Euclid Township. That's the area. And it certainly is very difficult to, on the Civil War records, to find the black troops. But I found 8 that may have lived, if not in Euclid, worked in Euclid or were in that area. And of those 8 that are definitely
USCT?
that, I could confirm on that, 5 of them died.
You have the same thing in Lincoln Cemetery. I'll be speaking in Gettysburg, and I'm going to be speaking at a memorial it's called the Lincoln Cemetery. They have a society around it. For many of for the people who are buried in that cemetery, right, within 3 years of the conclusion of the Civil War, they were now deceased. They basically died from some form of disease.
Compared to whatever information I got on the...
You're right. You get that. What you do have is that, you get... in that Lincoln Cemetery is very interesting because you get over half of 3/4 of the soldier dying within 5 years of the conclusion of the Civil War. So that's something to look at, something to actually take into consideration.
The other thing is, at least in Chester County area, there are a lot, or a handful at least, of these little cemeteries. And unfortunately, they were abandoned, families moved. Many of the blacks in the area didn't own their own land, so they were more transient, and the little cemeteries were kind of abandoned.
If you go up 113
Right, Woodmont.
and get to Woodmont
Right.
and go in,
I'm
there's
familiar-
a small little
yeah,
cemetery.
I'm
in the
familiar
back,
with that one.
And I have relatives who are buried there.
Is there any place that has any written records on that? Because I wasn't able to find very much.
I have a few.
They're actually in East Town, that cemetery,
Yeah.
but it's the people that I was studying that were in the area, because right up the road is the border between Euclid and East Town.
Well, I have
So-
relatives in there, and that's how I found out that he's related to my wife.
Oh. Is anyone else? So we got someone who's going to next definitely be looking at more into Civil War history. Looking at some of the cemeteries and documenting some of the stories. What else? Some more people with their takeaways.
I'm a little bit surprised about how the 54th was depicted on that picture. It only showed one man that was actually educated, and so my whole perspective on that movie has definitely changed. So now I want to go back and read Shaw and find out how these guys were. Because in the picture showed them they didn't have guns, and they didn't have them until a long time after they were already in the regiment.
trust me, you can go read Shaw's records, and then when you sort of see who was in his regiment, I want you to go and read their records as well, because they're extensive. I mean, they wrote their document, they wrote their narrative, they wrote their stories, they wrote how they were feeling and the like. So, I mean, again, it's one of those cruel injustices in history that people take something like the 54th, the 1st Northern Form Regiment, again, not the 1st Regiment, because you had the ones in Louisiana, but for the most part, the 1st Regiment, and sort of depict them as this, again, that's something that's safe. It's safe to believe that, you know, these people, you know, were somehow, you know, I mean, this one scene, for example, that I think in Glory that made me absolutely sick, when Denzel Washington is getting whipped, and only thing you see is a tear come down his face. I mean, if that's not Glorywood enough, I mean, you know, I mean, basically it says that somehow he can sit there and take cat o' nine tails and a whip, and he has some type of strength that he doesn't feel pain. And that's a subtle way to justify the cruel, of the levels of violence that was under the system of slavery in the first place. That somehow, you know, you can, you know, beat them and they don't feel pain like someone else would, who would be getting whips and lashes on the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, I mean, one more takeaway? One more person taking away?
Yes, I'm going to take away that freedom was not given to them. Never, ever thought of it that way. Because I grew up, history books are all one-sided. And take away this evening with you.
Thank you.
Well, my dilemma is to how, you know, going fast forward, how do we incorporate the truth in today's history? Because the way history books are written and education today, it doesn't tell the truth. And young people don't have a clear image of who they are or what their people have done to bring them to where they are today. It's still like it's an oppressive mindset that people were slaves and that's all that you can be. So how can you incorporate what you're saying here, you know, to bring it to a level of understanding in our classrooms today for our young people, because it's not there. It's
Have
not
them
clear.
have them talk to the grandparents.
I mean, that, and I mean, I think that the major piece is that, but also this read and interrogate the documents. I mean, I think that's the most important piece, because oftentimes we're now getting away from some of the understandings that people have. But then also, I mean, just look at, I mean, what people need to do is sort of look at the American story and the American tale. I mean, what do I mean by that? It means that you don't necessarily, I mean, you're looking at oppression and how people work themselves out and how they interrogated oppression. I wouldn't think that because a person of Irish background would have some type of knowledge about, you know, their ancestors who came over, you know, in the 1890s and 1900s and 1910s. I wouldn't think that they would know that information outside of maybe a family lore or a family story. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they have an understanding, if you will. And so I would say that it's best to read, and as you read the materials, it doesn't matter from what vantage point that you're coming in or how you enter the text or who you enter the text as, but the more you read documents, because sometimes some of these family stories are inaccurate. My husband's family had his people, his ancestor coming from Philadelphia. So he would have been going to Philadelphia and looking up records and wouldn't have found a Solomon Butcher. So that's why it's best to basically, Ms. Sylvia, I think it's crucial that people sort of start to, you know, put the documents in front of the students in saying, read. And it shouldn't be dictated by what they read, should not be dictated by their phenotype, meaning what hue they are, right? Because what I just told you about enough already was enough. I mean, the story I just said, I could give this same lecture in Irish American history if I wanted to explain the draft riots in New York, when they said enough already. You're taxing us, you're taxing us, you're taxing us, and now we're going to basically voice our grievance. Enough. And that is now a part of a larger fabric to how we get to the nation that we have, because people are willing to say, enough already. And so the stories that you don't necessarily have to learn the phenotype of hue to know how to say enough already. I mean, that's why I think that somebody like, Rosa Parks, sitting in that seat that day said, enough already. I'm not moving. And I don't think that you have to belong to a certain group to understand that level of enough. And that's what makes the story a universal one and an American one. So, hopefully we're walking away and we're leaving away when we sort of look at a story of something like the Underground Railroad. We're looking at a story in which the first people, the protest or the interrogation came when the person walked away. And when that person walked or, left that plantation, and then they would engage and interact with people along the way, the conductors and people who helped them along the way, those people now having their politics shaped by saying enough already. And so now you're looking at various points along the story that sort of impact. Sometimes I have a student once asked me that as an African American female, how is it that I'm just so enamored by the Declaration of Independence? And she says, because, that they didn't, the student said, that they didn't mean folks like, black people, Indians, women, and even poor white males. They didn't include that when they said, all men are, and I said, it's a vision. Who can't respect the vision? Just like the 14th Amendment of the United States. The one thing that the Constitution didn't really do is define citizenship. And so the Civil War helped to define citizenship with the 14th Amendment, the original Constitution. And so who can walk away without understanding that it's a vision? And a vision is something that any group or any person can get into, make it their own, and say, hey, look, this is not in a transient cause. This is something now that's in my core. I don't necessarily know if she got it. Maybe in years she will. But for the most part, that's what a problem with the problem with segregation in history. It's segregated so much out that people try to segregate humanity. Why couldn't I look at that document, just like it has inspired people within the United States since 1776, and it's inspired people outside of the United States? Why can't I look at that document and see myself? As Langston Hughes said in the poem, I too sing America. So to make me not be able to see that document and see myself, right? That's actually another assault against the people who helped to fight and shape the freedom that we know as the United States colored troops. We know as the slaves. We know who the people who were lynched. We know who the people who were segregated. They too were in part of that story. So I too sing America. And this idea that I can't, it was very interesting that I couldn't look at a document and see myself because it was written by wealthy white men who were educated. It's just absolutely foolish. I said, so thank you very much. That's the conclusion. Thank you. I would be remiss if I do want to do two things. I do want to thank I have some fellow board members who came out, and I really, school board members, and I really thank you, them for coming out. And I thank all of you for coming out. Our hope and our goal, this is a part of the Lucans, and it's also a part of the Historical Commission. I mean, what we're trying to do is have more sessions like this in our area to have levels of engagement so people can sort of know their areas, know the area in which they're in and know some of the conversations that they have. Now, one of the things that the Greystone Society does have is they do have a membership drive that's going on now. You can get a discounted membership, and hopefully what we're doing is this is just the second of in the past year, the second of major events. The last one was the Zachariah Walker, that we can basically start to have these type of conversations and forums, and we don't have to necessarily go to Philadelphia to see it. Okay? Thank you so much for coming out.